In this video, we'll think about the relationship between presuppositions, or assumptions, and interpreting biblical texts. It's a bit like reading through smudged windows. Presuppositions, for the present purpose, are more or less the same thing as assumptions. Presuppositions can be either consciously or subconsciously operative, or both. They can be used hypothetically, as in an experiment. If we hypothetically presuppose, just for argument's sake, that Jesus actually did not rise from the dead, what implications would that have for our reading of Luke 24, for example? Presuppositions take for granted something as true or valid without its needing to be demonstrated first. And they provide a working frame within which to act or think in some way. What then is a working frame? I presuppose or assume that gravity is a force as I sit down to breakfast or drive my car. The effect of gravity operates as a working frame for daily life on Earth. But this proves to be an inadequate working frame in the midst of a tornado. I assume that an English translation of Paul's letters is sufficient for a definitive interpretation. And this proves an inadequate assumption if someone challenges me from the Greek text. Framing, however, is inescapable. As human beings, we are inescapably bound to our space and time-defined existence. And we cannot avoid coming to biblical texts, or to any texts, without a set of presuppositions, a locational frame from within which to read. And this is actually a good thing, otherwise we could not interpret or understand anything at all. But we are not thereby guaranteed that our presuppositions provide us with a frame appropriate to what we wish to interpret. We may bring with us inappropriate assumptions, consciously or subconsciously. Our assumptions can come from various sources, helpfully or unhelpfully. One such source are culture-based assumptions. Affluent middle-class Americans naturally tend to read Scripture with Western eyes. We are quite aware of the commandment to devote one day a week to rest and worship, whether we obey it or not. Exodus reads this way: 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even in plowing time and in harvest time you shall rest. We are not so conscious of the corresponding commandment to work the other 6 days. Yet migrant Hispanic workers in the U.S. find themselves unable to keep that other commandment, although they are entirely willing to do so, and their livelihood depends on it. Individualism, as opposed to community, also provides a source of presuppositions. Culturally influenced as a Western reader of Scripture, I tend to assume that Scripture is a word meant specifically for me in my own personal life. Paul writes, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, a holy, acceptable sacrifice to God, which is your spiritual worship. We can easily miss the point here that Paul is calling the entire church to present themselves together as one single living sacrifice, a united community, holy unto God, not a collection of individuals. And this is only one example of thousands where we may tend to misread Scripture in an individualistic way. Then there are theology-based assumptions. We may assume, theologically, that God favors the redeemed and opposes the lost. Romans again. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of wrath that are made for destruction? And what if he has done so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? We may assume that the phrase vessels of wrath refers to the lost, and the phrase vessels of mercy refers to the redeemed. but there is good reason from the context to think that Paul meant it the other way around, that vessels of mercy are the lost, those on whom God still wants to have mercy, and that the vessels of wrath are his chosen people, who, like Jesus their Lord, are called to the task of suffering for the sake of the lost. And we have tradition-based assumptions. We may assume that what we have always thought the Scripture says is, in fact, what the Scripture does say. Taking a trivial example regarding the wise men in Matthew 2, does Scripture really say that there were 3 of them? Did the star really lead them all the way to Jerusalem from the east, or only from Jerusalem to Bethlehem? And did they really show up at the manger, along with the shepherds and angels? What does Matthew's text actually say about these things? And finally, for now, logic-based assumptions. Many believers assume that since the Scripture speaks of the elect, there must also be those who are not elect. If there are those who are predestined to salvation, there must be those predestined to damnation. It's logical. But is it really scriptural? What if elect simply means chosen for a task rather than chosen for salvation? My point is this: assumptions or presuppositions, while unavoidable, can be either appropriate or inappropriate to the text. They do, either rightly or wrongly, provide a frame within which to understand and interpret the text. And they need to be compared with assumptions from other cultures, theologies, traditions, and perspectives if we want to understand Scripture as it was meant to be understood. These assumptions and presuppositions are unavoidable. But although we cannot avoid bringing our assumptions to the interpretive task, and although those assumptions are heavily predetermined for us by our location, in terms of our culture, inherited theology, traditions, and logical expectations, nevertheless, they do not have to be left ignored to operate in the background, influencing our interpretations undetected. We can become aware of them, learning both to appreciate them and to evaluate their legitimacy and validity. We become aware of them by being exposed to the views of other people from many different locations, whether those people are fellow believers or not. When the Spirit of truth comes, says Jesus in John's Gospel, he will guide you into all the truth. What we need to hear in this text is that the Spirit leads us, not each individual, but us as a body, a community, a people of God. You, in this text, is plural in Greek, not singular. If we truly wish to understand Scripture, we must listen to each other across cultures, traditions, theologies, and worldviews. Otherwise, we will not fully understand God's message to us, and we will often misunderstand and mislead those whom we teach.